I'll begin, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Imagine a continent torn by multiple wars, beset by ethnic and religious conflict, malnutrition, disease, illiteracy, complicated by poorly drawn borders, and the incessant meddling of outside powers, supporting authoritarian rulers who ensure any revenues generated by the region's rich natural resources are spent on personal rather than national priorities. A description of Africa? No, it's actually a description of Asia, done in the mid-1970s. Africa and Asia share much in common, as both regions have endured centuries of decline, colonial domination, political instability, and economic stagnation before Asia embarked on a journey that would transfer it into the most economically vibrant zone on Earth. Africa is now embarking on that same journey. Africa has arrived at a similar level of development as China, India, South Korea 20 to 25 years ago. But with the experience and level of investment from those same countries, Africa's growth is expected to be more rapid. Africa is a producer, exporter, and domestic consumer of natural resources. Growth in export demand has been driven by China and India. However, a significant part of African growth story is rising domestic consumption. And I note Javier's comment that the export trade is going to perhaps suffer a continued downturn for a few more years. Domestic consumption, as Indonesia has certainly seen, is a key element of growth in mineral development policies. Africa is less than 20% explored for natural resources, yet the number of operating mines, projects, and prospects are huge, mainly due to strong interest from Australian, Canadian resource companies. The Indian Ocean, I reflect on the Indian Ocean because in the 1980s we coined a phrase, the Asia-Pacific Rim, or Pacific Ocean Rim, and therefore formed APEC, or the the Asia-Pacific Economic Community, a dialogue club for economic development, which has assisted the opening of trade and investment and the vast resources of particularly China and Indonesia. Now it's probably a good time to introduce the Indian Ocean Rim, with the eastern part of Africa in particular on one side, and Southeast Asia, Australia on the other side, and up in the north, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan on the northern side. And to introduce a similar concept to APEC that has assisted in the development of Asia, to assist in the development of trade, flow and economic policies and governance relating to the flow of goods over the Indian Ocean. Africa, 54 independent countries, 1.1 billion population, a young population, approximately 200 million aged between 15 and 24. About 128 million African households will earn over $5,000 per capita in 2020. Sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa, we always exclude South Africa when we talk about Sub-Saharan Africa, registering highest growth rates. Foreign direct investment in 2011 of $42.6 billion. 17.7 billion of those dollars came from China, and most of that money from China went into infrastructure development. Brazil, US, UK, and South Korea were also significant investors in Africa. Africa is endowed with incredibly rich resources, minerals, oil, gas, coal, vast agricultural land, and a resilient workforce. African economies are growing quickly. However, the main constraint, lack of electricity and infrastructure development. Now I'd like to turn to Eastern Africa, which is more pertinent to the Indian Ocean trade, although a lot of interest in the gold sector is towards the western part of Africa. If I deal with Eastern Africa, I define Eastern Africa as Tanzania. It seems to be the center of Eastern Africa and the countries around it. That's Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Democratic Republic of Congo, Malawi, Zambia, and Mozambique. And in the Indian Ocean, Madagascar, and the very interesting island nation of Mauritius. The region offers exceptional growth prospects in mining and energy, manufacturing, and agricultural development. The IMF listed 5 Eastern African nations, Uganda, Rwanda, Mozambique, Tanzania, and Malawi, as among the world's fastest growing countries from 2005 to 2010. The World Bank lists Mauritius as the 20th most friendly country towards the private sector, ahead of Germany and Switzerland, and Rwanda and Zambia among some of the top reformers in the world. The population of this area is approximately 300 million people, and GDP growth estimated as 7% in 2013. Ladies and gentlemen, Eastern Africa is the second fastest growing region in the world today, just behind China and certainly ahead of Indonesia. The next slide introduces the potential of Eastern Africa. In those countries, it's interesting to note the number of operating mines. There's 45 operating mines. There's 62 mining projects which are at bankable feasibility stage or coming to production. And there's a gigantic 308 exploration projects in the area, a huge number. The politics of Eastern Africa is generally stable. You may note the election in Kenya last week has resulted in a very stable and calm election environment. You may note the country of Mauritius has no mining whatsoever, but it's been called the Singapore of Africa. Low tax rates, it has double tax treaties and investment protection treaties with many of the countries in Africa, and 2 weeks ago it withdrew any visa requirements from any African nationals to establish itself as a conference center or meeting center of African nations, as well as having a very vibrant banking sector. Eastern Africa, what's the mining potential in Eastern Africa? I take note this is a mining conference. Historically, the emphasis in Eastern Africa has been on agriculture, and mineral exploration has only been recently undertaken outside South Africa. Colonial geological agencies undertook limited survey work, but lack of available funds has prevented government involvement in further mapping and geological work. Situation is changing with international funding agencies donating aerial reconnaissance surveys and technical assistance. As a consequence, and that's a mistake, it's not 80%, 20% of Eastern Africa has been comprehensively explored. And looking at the countries, you've got the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's got a bit of instability in the northwest, but it's expected that the Congo hosts yet to be discovered world-class mineral deposits, and the potential and the wealth of the Congo is easily akin to Indonesia and China. Kenya, largely unexplored. It's always been developed by the British as an agricultural centre, and consequently they're just now looking at it. Kenya is a very stable country. They're opening up the Mui Basin for coal and coal-bed methane development, very strong Chinese, Indian interests, huge requirement for services, mining services, drilling, exploration, general geological services. Recently, Tullow's found some oil in the north west portion of Kenya. Madagascar. Madagascar is best described by General de Gaulle as Madagascar has great potential, and Madagascar will always have great potential. The mineral sands development by Rio Tinto in the south, the embattled Ambatovi nickel operation by Sherritt in the west, host of gold, quartz vein gold deposits, coal at Socoa, chromite, graphite, a huge range of minerals. Unstable. We do hope that the election due in 2013 will bring a degree of stability to Madagascar. Malawi. Malawi is a peaceful country bordering Lake Malawi, views agriculture as the mainstay of the economy. Newly appointed president, the second female president in Africa, Joyce Banda, and she's a very engaging and dynamic president, and she's very keen to develop the export industries of Malawi. Mainly, the main producer there is Paladin, which has a uranium operation, and an associated company which we're opening a coal mining operation in Malawi. Malawi is like all the countries in Eastern Africa, huge shortage of electricity. It has approximately 120 megawatts for a country of 16 million people. And we're currently negotiating with the government to put in a 120 megawatt coal-fired power station. Mauritius, I've dealt with. Mozambique, world-class, as we all know, world-class coal deposits, approximately 23 billion tons of coal resources, a lot of it coking coal. It will be quite a major exporter. It's got a difficult infrastructure environment. And I think anyone, you can talk to Rio Tinto and ask them about the infrastructure environment of Mozambique. I'm sure they'll be able to enlighten you. Gold prospects, huge finds, a very wealthy and relatively totally unexplored country, except in Teti province where the coal resources have been found. Massive offshore gas, one of the largest finds in the world today of offshore gas in the northern part of Mozambique, which would make it and the southern part of Tanzania competitive to Australia's northwest shelf LNG operations, or even to the nation of Qatar in terms of the production of gas. Tanzania, one of the most spectacular natural resource countries of Africa, fourth largest gold producer, sometimes third. It depends on whether the revolutionaries take over a city in Mali. It has uranium, gemstones. All these Eastern African countries have diamond and gemstones, nickel, copper. We've got a 523 million tons JORC coal resource. To give you an example, from the time we applied to mine to the time the mining was granted after the environmental permits and everything had been obtained, took 7 months. In Australia, it takes about 3 to 7 years, and in Asia, with forestry permits in Indonesia, it can take years and years to get approval. So Tanzania is quite dynamic in that way. 46 million people, 800 megawatts of electricity for the whole country. About 4% of the population are connected to electricity. The gold mining companies run diesel generators, which is killing them. Diesel generation is about 45 cents per kilowatt hour compared to gas, which is about 16 cents per kilowatt hour. Uganda, never really been explored, just opening up now. Lake Albert, they've discovered some oil in Lake Albert. Zambia, Zambia is one of the leading countries. It contains about 10% of the world's supply of copper. It's one of the world's major copper producing countries. The new government of Zambia is addressing the mining industry to achieve a more responsible mining industry. It's shut down smelters and some operations which have not been viable. Electricity in Eastern Africa, the World Bank estimates that energy demand in Africa will grow by an average of 5.7% per year through to 2040. Africa will need $33 billion worth of power generation to meet a minimal 3.7% increase per year. Current supply of electricity in Eastern Africa is one of the lowest in the world for one of the richest regions. And as we know from what's happening in Indonesia and China and other parts of Asia, there's a huge potential in the development of power utilities in Africa. Resource business risks, there's always business risks. The business risks in Africa are no greater or no less than the business risks in Asia or in South America or in other countries. Resource nationalism, it's a growing trend. A lot of African countries point out Australia and the resources super tax, which has helped cripple some of the industry in Australia. Indonesia's proposed export levies for coal for domestic processing. All these things are commonly discussed in Africa. Skills shortage, that's a global challenge. It will be less so, as I hear from previous speakers today. The majors are all going into capital controls, which means that they've got to get rid of their excess labour from their relatively inefficient, from my point of view, operations. So maybe there will be an increasing number of skills available in the next year to the mining industry in the world, and hopefully a reduction in wage costs, which I think a lot of the skills have been grossly overvalued during the upturn in the industry in the last few years. Infrastructure, a major problem, very few railways, very limited road network. Political instability in Eastern Africa is basically stable. Congo, we've got a few problems. Burundi is addressing rebel movements, and Madagascar hopefully will be having their election this year. But certainly Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, Malawi are very, very stable countries. Probably the most vital issue facing mining companies in Africa is community issues. This is common throughout the world. I think that mining companies have not shared, have not been as open to communities, and consequently the expectation of communities have been driven up by resident politicians usually, and this has created some concerns. Corruption, corruptie, is something which is probably less prevalent and certainly not in the same scale as in Africa as it is in other areas. Petty corruption certainly exists as it does generally in many other areas. The Indian Ocean, the other side, the Asian side and Australian side. As you can see, Australia's looking at investment of $50 billion. You've got 230 Australian companies with 650 different mining projects. You have China largely in infrastructure, development in Africa, now getting into the acquisition of iron ore and copper and other mining deposits. Singapore is addressing the fact we, in the Singapore Business Federation, we mount almost monthly business delegations to selected African countries, and we're looking at the possibility of developing an Africa Centre in Singapore for policy development in Africa. Generally, Eastern Africa represents an outstanding opportunity for Asian engagement in the development of its natural resources and associated infrastructure. Other areas are service areas, and that's a huge potential there. It takes me 3 to 4 months to get a coal sample analysed in South Africa by a laboratory. A huge need for analytical work, for geoscientific work, in a region which has a huge upside and every opportunity of reaching that. It really surprises me that there has not been a more concentrated effort of engagement between Asia and Africa, with the exception of China and India. I believe as an investment destination, East Africa offers a far greater upside than you have in traditional Asian investment destinations. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'll leave it like that. Just to show my engagement in Africa, I'm a believer. We're involved in coal mining, in shale gas development, geothermal power. We're currently drilling geothermal resources in Tanzania. Our Afro-Asia Bank, which is a Mauritius bank, is in Zimbabwe, Botswana, Malawi, and looking at other countries, and our agricultural rice industry. And it's interesting, the largest rice importer in the world is not Indonesia or Asian countries, it's Nigeria. So with that, I leave it to you. Thank you very much.